It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. President Trump has sparked outrage over his latest display of solidarity with white bigots. On Wednesday, Trump retweeted 3 posts from the fringe British far-right group Britain First. These posts all contained anti-Muslim content. This prompted the group's deputy leader, Jada Franson, to express her thanks.
This is a message to the President of the United States, Donald Trump. I'd like to start by saying how delighted I am that, as the leader of the free world, you took the time out to retweet 3 of my videos on Twitter today.
Franson faces charges in the UK for inciting hate against Muslims. The White House has not apologized for Trump's retweet, and in fact, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders defended it.
Whether it's a real video, the threat is real, and that is what the president is talking about. That's what the president is focused on, is dealing with those real threats, and those are real no matter how you look at it.
So does it matter if the video is fake?
Look, I'm not talking about the nature of the video. I think you're focusing on the wrong thing. The threat is real.
Joining me now is Gerald Horne, historian and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston. Professor Horne, we've had you on many times since Trump took office to discuss his sympathy and defense of white supremacists. Didn't seem fathomable that he could take it to a new level, but with this latest round of retweets, appears like he has. Your thoughts on Trump's actions here?
Well, you may recall that approximately a year ago, Mr. Trump was elected with 63 million votes, and an argument erupted in progressive circles as to whether or not it was that propelled so many to vote for him, or whether it was racial animus. Fast forward to November, December 2017, and I think we have an answer. That is to say, as a massive tax cut for the wealthy is making its way through Congress, to redistributing wealth from bottom to top, you see that a good number of Trump's base are not getting the benefit of that tax cut, but they are getting the quote benefit unquote of racism. That is to say that they are getting tweet storms demonizing Muslims, demonizing immigrants, demonizing Black athletes, demonizing Latinos and Mexicans. And I think we now have that answer to what was posed in November 2016. I think only the naive would now suggest that racism was not a factor, not only in the election of Donald Trump, but also in helping to solidify his base. Because as you know, there has been hardly a crack in his base. They are still with him for the most part.
My only question there is whether the base is so easily diluted that they're not even being made aware of all the policies that Trump is doing that undermine all of his various promises to fix the dire economic straits that they were in.
Well, you may know that in the election in Virginia, which was a kind of referendum on Trump, it is true that Ed Gillespie, the Republican nominee for governor, who half embraced Trump, lost. However, keep in mind that if you look at a map of the state of Virginia, which Hillary Clinton won by a few points, you will see a mostly red map. That is to say that Ed Gillespie, the Trump-backed candidate, basically won the white vote, which should not come as a surprise to any who pay even negligible attention to U.S. politics. I think we should not delude ourselves about the United States of America. We should not try to convince ourselves that what we are seeing is not actually taking place. Go back a quarter of a century when David Duke, a Klan leader and neo-Nazi, ran for governor of Louisiana and got 55 to 60% of the white base. Once again, a debate erupted as to whether or not it was economic anxiety that caused so many Euro-Americans to vote for a Klansman. That may have been a factor, but what happens is that generally speaking, I think that many of our friends on the left are uncomfortable talking about racism, so they tend to either discuss it abstractly or sweep it under the rug.
And fair enough. And I should clarify, I don't mean at all to suggest that racism was not a major factor in Trump's election. I guess I, as someone who identifies with the left, am uncomfortable when economic issues are totally cast aside, where it becomes sort of either or instead of both?
Well, certainly it's both, but with regard to those 63 million who we supposedly have to convince to pursue their class interests, apparently they are not interested in pursuing their class interests, which means we have to look for alternatives. Otherwise, we'll have a lot of time to discuss these issues in an internment camp at Yankee Stadium, for example. What this suggests is that we should pay much more attention to the international situation. I think part of the danger of what Trump has done is that he is whipping up right-wing sentiment in Europe, particularly in Great Britain. You may recall that just a few days ago in Warsaw, Poland, there were 60,000 marching under a frankly neo-fascist banner calling for a, quote, Islamic Holocaust, unquote. What's striking about that Warsaw protest was how Donald Trump's words were invoked. That is to say that I think it's long past time for we in the United States to recognize that the country in which we're residing is now the clearest threat to international peace and security, and in many ways is the right-wing anchor of the global community.
Right. So as a historian, can you talk about the history of using anti-immigrant sentiment and racism in general towards consolidating the power of domestic elites, especially here in the US?
Well, there are so many examples to choose from, one hardly knows where to start. But let's start in the 1890s with the so-called populist movement. That term does not have the pejorative connotation it does today. I'm speaking of populism. It was a grassroots movement, principally of agricultural workers and farmers, who were railing against being exploited by the railroads, which were dominated by robber barons. But strikingly enough, Tom Watson of Georgia, who was a Euro-American leader of the populist movement, basically he reversed Phil and became a leader of the white supremacist movement. And what's striking about Tom Watson and what happened in Georgia was that by 1915, they were not only lynching Black Americans, which they had been doing for some years, they also lynched a Jewish man, Leo Frank, which of course helped to bring many affluent Jewish people in New York into the movement for civil rights, helping to back the then newly born NAACP. This question of using racism as a tool, of course, arises most dramatically, perhaps, in the 1960s with the so-called Southern strategy of Richard M. Nixon. That is to say, the Republican Party recognized that after President Lyndon Baines Johnson pushed through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, finally guaranteeing the right of Black Americans and others the right to vote, that there would be a so-called white backlash, which of course then ensued, which then sunk movements not only for equality going forward, but also movements of class solidarity, that is to say, building trade unions, which still, I might argue, should be a leading priority today.
Right. So when Trump retweets an account from an avowed Islamophobe, like that leader of the group Britain First, do you think he's making a thought out calculation, an attempt to appeal to his base? I mean, how cynical and calculated do you think his whole fueling of racist sentiments is?
Well, it's difficult to say. I'd have to get him on the couch and do a psychoanalysis to get a precise answer. But going on the evidence that we have before us, I think it's a very cynical manipulation. Keep in mind as well that in recent days, according to close advisors quoted off the record, Trump has talked about reviving the so-called birther controversy, the idea that Barack Obama, the previous president, was not born in the United States, which would have made him illegitimate in terms of being a US president. Mr. Trump backed down from that about 14 months ago, but now he sees the need to whip it up again. It's apparent that this is a cynical manipulation. That is to say, as the plutocrats get tax cuts and benefits and wealth raped and shoveled into their bulging pockets, the working class and middle class base of Mr. Trump gets tweet storms about racism, gets birther controversies, which obviously they feel is something they need. Otherwise, we'd see in the polls that they had rebelled against them.
We'll leave it there. Professor Gerald Horne of the University of Houston, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.